CGTN, China Global Television Network.
10 African leaders addressed the 72nd regular session of the UN General Assembly held in New York over the past 2 weeks. On the agenda were many topics that could have a direct impact on the future of the African continent, including social development, global trade and environmental conventions, as well as UN reform. And the African leaders in attendance did not hold back when it came to expressing the continent's concerns. But the Assembly's theme of focusing on people striving for peace and a decent life for all on a sustainable planet could not have been more timely and appropriate for 2017. So how effective has the meeting been at addressing the issues facing the continent? And what more needs to be done by Africa at the United Nations General Assembly? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The annual general debate of the United Nations 193 member states is characterized by speeches and high-level meetings. And this year's assembly saw many first-time speakers, including Donald Trump. But African leaders refused to be overshadowed by the controversial U.S. president, with South Africa's Jacob Zuma, Egypt's Abdel El-Sisi, and Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe all tackling controversial issues themselves. Let's take a look at some of the highlights of this year's debate.
The current structure of the global economy continues to deepen the divide between the global north and global south. While a few enjoy the benefits of globalization, the majority of the peoples of the world still live in abject poverty and hunger.
Climate change is a present reality, and so are its effects and impacts. Climate change is global. We cannot remain silent when a major economic power in the world, or any other state for that matter, decides to abandon the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And that's the United States, the great United States, Mr. Trump's United States.
The African Union is fully committed to prioritizing prevention, mediation, promoting dialogue and finding peaceful political solutions, and also peace building. These are all less costly than peacekeeping operations whose effectiveness raises many questions.
I tell the Palestinian people it's extremely important to unite behind the goal and overcome differences and seize opportunities, and to be ready to accept coexistence with the others, the Israelis, in safety and security, and to achieve stability and security for all. And I say, and I direct my call to the Israeli people, we have an excellent experience in Egypt in peace with you for longer than 40 years. We can repeat this experience and this excellent step once again. The peace and the security of the Israeli citizen, together with the peace and security of the Palestinian citizen.
And now to offer further analysis into the 72nd UN General Assembly and Africa's representation there, I have expert guests standing by. In Lagos, Ola Bello, he's the Executive Director at Good Governance Africa. In Johannesburg, Michael Tudakasa, he's the CEO at Africa Business Group. And with me in Nairobi here in studio, Dr. Mustafa Ali, he's the co-founder of the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining in on the program. Dr. Mustafa, let me start off with you because you attended the UN General Assembly proceedings, or some of them at least. African leaders attended and gave their statements there. What's your take on their presentations?
Yeah, I think some of the African leaders that were at the General Assembly were excellent. They spoke to the issues that they needed to speak to, issues that are troubling the world today, and in particular the South. If you heard Jacob Zuma, Robert Mugabe, including Buhari, they spoke to issues that are affecting the security of the world. In particular, Zuma talked about the fact that the United Nations should actually do more. And Museveni supported Donald Trump's call for a reformed United Nations, which is long overdue. The organization has been there since 1946, remained largely the same, has not reformed, and it seems that it is not responding to the challenges, particularly the challenges of security, as it should in the 21st century.
Right. Michael Tudekasa?
I think that issue that was just mentioned by my colleague about security was a very important one. I think that also during the week's activities, the effort by Donald Trump in particular to curry favor and show some knowledge with African leaders, although he misspoke about Nambia, the general shift was that there's business opportunity in Africa. And I think for the days after his comments, there was a lot of news coverage of that point.
Right. Olabello.
I mean, I have to underline, you know, what the United Nations General Assembly is actually about. I think it's often a great opportunity for leaders to come out and make good speeches at the UN General Assembly every September. I think much of the work that often needs to be done, and in Africa's case, there are legion of issues that I think are concerning the continent at this time. We must see it for what it is, an opportunity to get up on the podium and say nice things. But I suspect much of what Africa needs to push forward in terms of the agenda that most concern the continent, security, climate change, also ensuring that there is adequate funding for a lot of the UN peacekeeping missions. A lot of them here in Africa, much of those work need to take place outside the UN General Assembly chambers.
Right.
So in terms of platitudes and looking good in front of the camera, I think they've done well. Much of the work would need to now take place you know, after the UN General Assembly week.
Right. Dr. Mustafa, a few issues that have been raised by the panel here, issues of security, issues of business and trade. Let's start off with that whole question of the global divide, because President Zuma did talk about the widening global divide between the global north and the south, and he talked about the system being unjust and ensuring that the global south remained in abject poverty. How unjust is it?
Essentially, there is a lot of injustice in the manner in which the trading is being done, for example. That the business people, the farmers from the global south are not able to access markets from the more developed north. And this is done by design. If you look at the WTO rules, if you look at the rules that are there, they are actually designed to keep some of these countries down. If you look at the way the International Monetary Fund is structured, the World Bank is structured, no African, nobody from the south can ever ascend to the helm of the World Bank. The World Bank has always got to be led by the United States of America and the IMF by a European. And this in itself tells you that there is no place for the Africans and people from the South at the table. And you know, if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. You will just be selected and you will be chosen whatever food that should be eaten. Now, the second point here is, and we in Africa especially have to take full responsibility for this,
right,
is that our leaders majority of our leaders seem to not understand what governance and statecraft is. They just want to amass wealth for themselves, and they don't really care about the countries that they are leading.
Right. Michael Tudekasa, you have mentioned that President Donald Trump did talk about doing business in Africa. And Africa's been talking about more trade, less aid. But of course, one of the issues that came up was exactly where globalization was heading. So how is Africa going to benefit, or the Global South going to benefit, if multilateralism is waning?
Well, I think we're on a trajectory that didn't necessarily start this year, where Africa is going to have to play a greater role in its own economic development in terms of promoting and facilitating intra-African trade. I think that the trend towards less aid is still there. We always are looking for humanitarian support when we can have it. We have a tremendous drought in East Africa that speaks to a need for greater resilience. We have still tremendous need for investment in electrification. So the discussion around renewable energy support from the UN and global North countries continues. But the challenge remains that domestic resource mobilization is going to be key. And the African Union, under the leadership of the president of Rwanda, has started looking at how the continent and the member states of the AUC can raise capital to fund the initiatives that have to happen. I think that theme also was one that you could pull from the conversations during the meetings last week.
Right. Olabello, your view is that this has been more of a talk shop and work needs to start now. What work is that you would like to see?
Well, I think, we must leverage the UN General Assembly for what it is, on the specific question of inequality in the world that you talked about. It's always been clear what we need to do, a lot that needs to happen on the continent in terms of growing regional economies. So all of those things are about creating the enabling domestic environment for African entrepreneurs and other actors to succeed. But when we go to the United Nations, we must necessarily talk about that aspect that relates to the outside world and what partners can do in support of Africa and in partnership with our continent. So I'm very pleased to see that a lot of the leaders attended the meeting convened by the United States President to talk about some of these issues. But we cannot run away from it. I think we are at a very interesting juncture here where I think the 1 or 2, 3 issues that are most paramount for Africa in terms of our joint interest with global partners have been thrown into a lot of doubt, given the pronouncement we've had from the United States President, from climate change, from whether AGOA would be renewed. We've had some reassuring noises on all of those things. I think it's all very much up in the air, but it's good that we're having this conversation so that both sides can better understand where the interests are.
Dr. Mustafa, though, a lot of the conversations on eradicating poverty there did talk about the inequitable nature of the situation. So exactly how does the Global South want a reform of the economic structures or the other structures to ensure that that divide is bridged?
Yeah, I think 2 things here. One is those that can be carried out within the framework of the United Nations, and this is where the Sustainable Development Goals come in, the SDGs that actually succeeded the Millennium Development Goals, that there are a range of 16 different goals and many actions and yardsticks. That is one area. Then the second bit is, the more economic aspects of issues that are normally carried out in the frameworks of the World Trade Organizations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Now, if these institutions are not going to be reformed to ensure that Africans are at the policy table, then I'm afraid to say that there will be nothing that will be there for the Africans, and we will continue to suffer. As long as the African farmer is not going to get the worth of his or her produce because of the subsidies that are there in the north, then it's still going to be poverty for that poor farmer. It's not going to happen until we have visionary leaders. And as Olabello is saying, we still a long way to go in terms of even understanding the international economic regime.
Right. Olabello, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, if there is something I would like to inject into this conversation, what's been really surprising for me is the reluctance to actually call a spade on the part of the African leaders, putting squarely on the table some of those issues that are paramount for Africa that I talked about and which I think are being significantly threatened by the posture of the United States President. We can enumerate a number of those issues. On climate change, whether the United States is staying in or out, I think all of that is still up in the air.
Right.
Cutting back on the United Nations budget, I think we all agree this reform needs to take place, but the United States needs to continue to fund a huge chunk of this. If peacekeeping mission in Congo, Mali, and elsewhere would go ahead, I don't think African leaders have been forthright in arguing for the continuation of some of these. And I think you see this in a broad suite of areas. I would like to see a bit more forthrightness and direct pronouncement on the part of African leaders in a way that President Trump might not welcome, but I think this necessarily have to be part of the difficult conversations that we must have with partners like the United Nations and the other partners at the United Nations.
Olabella, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you for joining us on the program. And for now, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll have more insights into Africa's representation at the UN General Assembly. Stay with us.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Some of us were embarrassed, if not frightened, but what appeared to be the return of the biblical giant called Goliath, who threatens the extinction of other countries. And may I say to the United States President, Mr. Trump, please blow your trumpet. Blow your trumpet in a musical way towards the values of unity, peace, cooperation, togetherness, dialogue, which we have always stood for, and which are well written in our very sacred document, the Charter of the United Nations.
Well, that was Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe scolding U.S. President Donald Trump for his comments towards the Democratic People's Republic of Korea at the 72nd UN General Assembly last week. Welcome back to Talk Africa. We continue our discussion now into the outcomes of the meeting and Africa's representation there. And I still have my expert guest standing by in Johannesburg, Michael Sudakasa, CEO at the Africa Business Group. And joining us now from New York, Tiamiyu Arobani. He's the North American Bureau Chief for the News Agency of Nigeria. With me in Nairobi, Dr. Mustafa Ali is still here with me. Tiamiyu Arobani, I'll come up to you though, because those were quite forceful statements from President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. Do you get the feeling, though, that Africa's sentiments at the United Nations now are starting to get a voice?
Yes, whichever way you look at it, Africa is a very important continent, in the world, and also in the UN. And the voice of Africa, has become very powerful, Africa has 54 countries, and which is the largest continent represented on the UN. So when any resolution is going to be taken on the floor of the General Assembly, when Africa votes as a group, as a bloc, whether for or against, it tells a lot, on whether the resolution is going to pass or not. And you also have to understand the fact that Africa has had its own toll of a crisis. We know what is happening now in South Sudan. We know what is happening, in Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Africa does not want the world where there's going to be violence again. We have had enough of violence.
Right.
And that is why everybody is calling for peace.
I want to take up that point, though, with Dr. Mustafa here in studio with me, because the crisis on the continent, as TMIU is mentioning there, and President Mugabe did talk about that, and he actually looked at how much money was spent on military expenditure in 2016. He said $1.6 trillion was used in military expenditure as compared to $142.6 billion spent on overseas development assistance. Do you agree, though, with his assessment that the military expenditure has not necessarily translated into peace and security on the continent? Absolutely,
Beatrice. Absolutely. To spend, first of all, that kind of money on military expenditure is a pointer to the kind of world that we are in today. And nobody is going to manufacture arms and just, be content to keep them in the stores. They're going to use them. The British are using their arms through Saudi Arabia, bombing Yemen, and we see that being, the bombings being carried out on daily basis. What is happening in other places, conflicts that can be resolved through dialogue and talking. And when you look at the amount of money that is used for development, it's very little. And monies that are used to manufacture arms do not produce anything. It is just to go and destroy. And Mugabe was spot on there.
Dr. Mustafa, is it time, though, now that Africa looks for a different approach with its partners when it comes to peace and security issues on the continent, when it comes to military expenditure for peace and security issues on the continent? Is it time to relook at the approach?
Yeah, it is time that Africa evaluates the kind of partnerships that we have with some of the countries around the world with regard to our own security. There are those countries that have been interfering with the affairs of other nations. Libya, for example, UN Resolution 19, Security Council Resolution 1973 on the responsibility to protect. That was pushed so far to actually push for a regime change that led to the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, which are the countries that prosecuted that? It was the United States of America, Britain, in France. And no wonder now you see that China and Russia are actually vetoing resolutions that wish to sanction Syria. Right. So it is up to African leaders, and they have to reevaluate those kind of partnerships that are not in the interest of the African countries.
Tiama, you were following this from New York, though. In terms of what you felt came out strongly about Africa, in terms of the resolutions, what stood out?
Yes, the resolutions at the United Nations, has always been that Africa vote in group. And you also have to understand the fact that Africa has had its own toll of a crisis. We know what is happening now in South Sudan. We know what is happening, in Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Africa does not want the world where there's going to be violence again. We have had enough of violence, and that is why everybody is calling for peace. You can also see the statement of the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. He is saying diplomacy, should be the watchword now, in resolving the crisis in North Korea. Nuclear war is not something that Africa wants now. So there's the need to employ their diplomacy.
Michael, yeah. Just coming back to Africa's issues and Africa in focus, though, just how effective do you think that meetings at the UN have been for Africa? And moving forward, though, what should Africa put emphasis on going into the next year?
Well, I think that we go into the UN meetings, at least this year, we went into them with a lot that is unclear globally. The U.S. not supporting efforts toward climate change is a big challenge. The U.K. undertaking Brexit and pulling out of the EU, and that's going to be continuing, means that there's not clarity about either the UK relationship with Africa or the EU relationship with the continent. We are also at a point, and I think it was mentioned by one of the colleagues, that African participants at the UN General Assembly are also using that annual trip to lobby in other areas. There were a lot of meetings around diaspora engagement this year. Remittances have been noted as huge contributors from a financial standpoint to the continent, but there's also an effort to look at technical assistance, direct investment. And so you saw leaders traveling down to Washington, D.C., inviting stakeholders to New York to maximize the benefit of being in New York. There were also discussions about sectors of interest like agriculture, where efforts were made. And again, the idea of public-private partnership is much stronger, and I think it will continue to be because the UN as a vessel exclusively at this juncture is unstable in large part because of it seems like the lack of commitment from the United States to support.
Right. Dr. Mustafa, do you feel that these meetings have been effective, and moving forward, where should Africa be putting their emphasis?
They have certainly yielded some fruits, Beatrice, but in my opinion, they are not the most effective meetings, and I still would like to see much more interests of the African people represented at the United Nations. Now, if the United Nations is not going to be reformed, and that's where we support Donald Trump on the reformation of the United Nations, then Africa is still going to get a raw deal. The Security Council of the United Nations is not demographically representative. There is no African country or Latin American country that sits there as a permanent member. They are always one of or two of the 10 non-permanent members. Now, the African leaders, with our own regional organizations, the Africa Union, IGAD, ECOWAS, SADC, they really have to work much harder to make sure that the interest of Africans are represented there as a bloc. And that is the only way Africans can get anything useful out of the United Nations.
Right. Tiamiyu Arobani, very briefly though, in terms of effectiveness for Africa's voice, did that come out?
Yes, I agree with the last speaker that we need a reformed Security Council. You know, this is the most important multilateral organization in the world. As the Security Council is composed right now, you know, it is not representative. You know, a United Nations that is you know, promoting democracy also need to be democratic. But the reform that the U.S. president is talking about, you know, we should not forget that he's not talking about reforming the Security Council. He's talking about administrative reform, cutting down on UN funding. You know, but now we need Africa to be represented on the Security Council. No matter what we say at the General Assembly is just a talk shop. You know, where real actions are taken is on the Security Council.
Right, Tiamiyu Arobani, we'll leave it there for the moment, and thank you all for joining us on the program. That's all we have time for this week, but thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Michael Tudekasa, CEO at the Africa Business Group. In New York, Tiamiyu Arobani, North American Bureau Chief for the News Agency of Nigeria. And with me in studio, Dr. Mustafa Ali. Thank you all for being on Talk Africa. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.